My first apology nie говорю по-русски, sorry, по-английски. And my second apology is that you've been here since 10 o'clock, and I'm sure you're thinking more about your stomach than your brains, but I will try and provide some intellectual food for thought, and this should serve you okay to go into lunch. Okay, a couple of months ago, on the 2nd of November 2017, the centenary of the Balfour Declaration took place, 100 years since the Balfour Declaration. Now, I was privileged to go to, there was a special dinner with Netanyahu came, and also Theresa May, and they made speeches. And Bibi Netanyahu said how wonderful England was, and British fought the Nazis, and they gave England the Balfour Declaration, and Theresa May said, yes, we were very proud to give the Balfour Declaration, we liked the Jews, and etc. And of course this was all nonsense, because at the end of the day what mattered in terms of the Balfour Declaration was British national interests in a time of war, 1917. It didn't matter whether a British politician was philo-Semitic, pro-Jewish, or anti-Semitic, or pro-Zionist, or anti-Zionist. These were secondary concerns. What mattered was British national interest and whether Britain could win the war, particularly the war in the Middle East. Now, there were two prime ministers, as you may know, of Great Britain. Herbert Asquith, who was the prime minister from the beginning of the war. He resigned in December 1916. And then there was David Lloyd George, who was the great war leader who gave the Balfour Declaration to the Jews, which promised a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, and is seen as one of the foundational documents of the coming of the State of Israel, the rise of the State of Israel. Now, Lloyd George was Welsh. He came from Wales. He identified Wales with Palestine. He came from a religious background as well, a Christian background, although he wasn't religious at the time of the Balfour Declaration. Lord Reading was one of the leading Jewish figures at the time, spoke of Lloyd George having a poetic vision of Zionism. In 1931, at a meeting at the Savoy Hotel, which is one of the most expensive hotels in the centre of London, to the English Zionist Federation, Lloyd George said this. This is April 1931. "You will not be offended if I tell you that the names of these valleys and hills in Canaan, are as sacred to the Gentile, to the non-Jew, as they are even to the Jew. I heard of Jezreel and Esdraelon, of Carmel and of Sion, before I knew of the existence in my own land," meaning Wales, "of the valley of Glamorgan or Plynlimon." So this is Lloyd George talking about Wales and talking about Palestine. The timeline. World War I broke out, at least for Britain, on the 4th of August 1914. 2 days before, there had been a treaty of alliance between the Turks and the Germans, the 2nd of August. And that meant that Turkey came into the war, the Ottomans came into the war in November 1914. Now, within a few days of that, within a few days of the declaration of war, Herbert Samuel, who was, as you may know, was the first High Commissioner in Palestine, the first Jew to sit in a British cabinet, suddenly became very interested in the idea of Zionism. Okay. He'd never shown any interest before. But it was clear to anyone that if war had broken out between Turkey and Britain, it was clear that the British, who had been in Egypt since 1882, could move down, across Suez, up to Palestine. It was very clear. And therefore, from the very beginning, Britain, and also France, and also Russia, and also Italy, were interested in the Middle East. They knew that if Turkey was defeated, they could divide up the Middle East between themselves. So, within a few days, Herbert Samuel bumps into the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, and said, wouldn't it be a good idea if the Jews had a homeland in Palestine? And Sir Edward Grey said, yes, very good idea. Bumps into him in the corridor. Yeah? On the 3rd of December 1914, David Lloyd George has breakfast with Samuel, with Chaim Weizmann, who was a lecturer in chemistry in Manchester, and with C.P. Scott, who was the editor of The Guardian, who was then known as the Manchester Guardian. It's one of the major papers today in Britain. And they discussed this. This is literally a few weeks after the entry of Turkey into the war. On the 15th of January 1915, Lloyd George has breakfast once again with Samuel and Chaim Weizmann. And more important is that two memoranda are presented to the British Cabinet by Herbert Samuel. One in January 1915, one in March 1915. First one is called The Future of Palestine, second one is called Palestine. These are presented to the British Cabinet a few weeks after the declaration of war with Turkey. And in fact, the first one, The Future of Palestine, talks about